Thank you very much. What a lovely welcome. Thank you. I was delighted to be asked to speak. First of all, go Seahawks. Congratulations to all of the Seattleites here. Um, I'm more of a Denver fan myself, but we'll let that slide for now. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here and to talk to you all about this topic that I think is front of mind for everyone right now. I spend a lot of my time speaking with not only content designers but hiring managers, and I think this is something that is weighing on a lot of people right now, especially as there's a lot of questions about what is the future of design, content design in particular, and also just the way we make products. So I'm excited to talk about this. I should say as well, if as I'm speaking, if you have comments, please drop them in the chat. I do love reading what people are thinking as I'm talking. So don't feel the need to sort of hold back. I do enjoy a good comment. So feel free. So that was a lovely introduction for myself. I do run the UX Content Collective. I do host a podcast. If you're interested in hearing what people have to say about content design and UX writing, I try and get as many episodes as I can out. Can be a little bit difficult. And if you ever want to talk to me on LinkedIn about movies, I'm always up for it. I'm a bit of a desperate movie fan, and if you like Almost Famous, then you are guaranteed to be my good friend. So feel free to reach out. So I already know that everyone or most people in this chat will be familiar with a lot of the requirements in content design job ads right now, and but I think over the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years, there has been an increase in the number of ads that are asking for technical skills. Now, I don't even mean AI skills. Everyone seems to be sort of asking for AI skills. Um, what's happening alongside that is a rising expectation of what content designers and designers in general can do both on their own and with engineers and developers. I'm going to get into a few reasons about why that's happening. And then we're going to talk about a few things that you, as a content designer, can do to engage in that way and to wield some influence there. So I've just pulled a couple of examples here, and there are many. If you go on LinkedIn and do a quick search, you'll find these types of descriptions in these job ads. You'll see things like things asking content designers to partner with engineers to both design and run human in the loop eval. So that's for AI. Meta in particular is well known for asking content designers to understand how code works within software and to review it within code, review strings in code. And I think it's interesting to see the number of job ads that are asking for these types of skills. Um, there was a really great analysis done recently, and I'm just going to drop the link for this in the chat. A There we go. There's a Substack where the author has conducted an analysis of different job ads, content design job ads in particular, and analyzed what they are all asking for. And of course, you'll see the pretty obvious ones there: UX fundamentals, collaboration, all that jazz. What's really interesting is seeing the number of job ads that ask for tools and technical skills. It's even higher than the number of job ads that are asking for AI skills, which I thought was interesting. So it's a real thing. Companies are asking for these types of skills, but I think there is some confusion about what it means to be technical. That really has a lot of, it's kind of a loaded word. There's a lot of baggage associated with that word. And it's good to understand what does it actually mean to be technical, but also why? Like, what's the point? Why do we want to learn these types of technical skills? We don't want to just learn things for the sake of learning them. That might be interesting, but is it useful? Instead, what we should be thinking about is what are the technical skills I can learn that will help me do my job better as a content designer, make the content experience better for the user, and help me wield influence in the organization I work in order to actually get stuff done better, quicker, faster, more efficiently. And I think we need to acknowledge, of course, that content design, has always been technical. If you look at the spectrum of content designers, I think on the one hand, you might have people who come to content design from fairly technical backgrounds. So I'm thinking technical writers, people who have been working in information architecture for a long time who have had to work with some fairly archaic technical systems. So, on that end of the spectrum, you have people who are very comfortable with understanding strings in code, concepts like, what is an API, what is JavaScript, understand how to navigate GitHub and that sort of thing. On the other side of the spectrum, you have people who quite the opposite, don't really know how to navigate all of any of that and focus on the craft. Like obviously there are some gimmies you have. You need to understand what a user interface is and how a product is sort of put together at a conceptual level. But for a lot of people, they are very far removed from that technical knowledge. I tend to think that most content designers are somewhere in the middle. And the reason that a lot of people, I think, or I should say a lot of content designers, haven't tried or attempted to learn more technical concepts is because there's just a steep learning curve there. I don't know if anyone here has tried to learn to code. It's not intuitive. If you are someone who comes to content design from a background in, say, humanities or a different type of writing, I came to content design from journalism. My mind works very differently than someone whose mind navigates to understanding code. And so it's just an unfamiliar environment and it can be quite scary. And I have to say, all love to the engineers and developers out there. I think when trying to learn these types of concepts, you can actually encounter a lot of circular definitions. So you'll ask someone like, what's a Node.js runtime? And you'll get an explanation like, oh, it's a runtime that empowers Node.js. And you'll be like, oh, cool. I didn't learn anything then. Thank you. And that again, that's not to disparage anyone. I think it's just that the technical concepts are very hard to wrap your head around if you try and get into it from the outside. And as a result, content design has largely been about craft, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing that we focus on that. It is our superpower. It is our strength. It will continue to be. Um, but it does slightly put us at a disadvantage. If we don't understand enough about the products we're working in, we can be on the back foot a little bit. So until now, it's been a little bit easy to hide from these types of technical concepts. Um, that has changed, and for a couple of reasons. So the first is that, as I say quite accurately here, I think large language models are built on language, duh. And so the thing that's powering AI is something that we understand very well and can work with every day. So content problems and engineering problems are really now intertwined. And so you're having a lot of content designers who are I've spoken to so many content designers who have said, I've had engineering colleagues come to me for the first time asking me for my help on crafting system messages more efficiently and how to create evaluation or canonical example data and that sort of thing. So there's a kind of a melding of minds that's happening. And secondly, the number of coding tools that are now being developed and available to everyone. So I'm thinking Claude Code, Codex, Cursor, Copilot, that sort of thing. Uh, this is empowering people. These tools are empowering people to navigate code bases without having to use complex commands in a terminal or having to navigate GitHub and look through all of these different files to understand where things are. You can actually now engage with the code using the tool that you have and know best, which is language. So this is what's changing. And as a result, you may have seen this quote before. The hottest new programming language is English. I tend to think of that in both the obvious way, which is to say you can now code using English, but I also like to think of it as almost as like a not a mantra, but almost like a motto. And I almost think that you can now think of English as the way you can start interfacing with everything in a product. And that includes technical concepts. So I like to think that we are in an empowering moment right now. There really is no excuse left for us to not engage with these types of concepts and how our products are built. And not just because it's interesting, but because it can actually unlock a lot of opportunity. In the same way that there's not a barrier into writing, no one can really stop you from writing anything. Like everyone can write. I know that has its challenges in an organization because a lot of people think that they can write well when they can't. But it also goes the other way. There's no longer a structural reason not to engage with these types of technical concepts now because the barrier has really kind of disappeared. Now, of course, there's details there and there's caveats there, and not everyone has access to these types of tools. Not everyone is going to be able to access your own code base in your own organization. Things are often walled off into different sections. Totally understand that. Today is not really necessarily about understanding how to do completely everything. It's about understanding where you can engage and knowing when you can engage and when maybe you can't. So I think it's important to understand as well, like, why are we learning this? It isn't just about learning technical things for the sake of learning them. It's about solving problems. So lately, I've been having a lot of conversations with content designers, and they will ask, what is it that I can actually do from learning these skills? And I think, well, think about the problems that you're having now or wanting to fix now and are running into roadblocks because of them. Things like changing strings in product. A lot of content designers engage with strings in Figma, and that's where their relationship with strings will stop. And so that to them is the source of truth. In order to get a change into the product, they need to first change it in Figma and then go through a whole workflow. What if you were able to bypass all of that and change strings directly in the code itself? So you remove a few layers between yourself and what the user is actually seeing. You can empower yourself to actually make these types of changes. Content audits are a big thing. When you get into an organization or into a new feature or a product that you're working on and you want to get the lay of the land, conducting an audit can take quite a long time if you don't know what you're doing. Understanding how to use the technical skills and your technical knowledge to get an audit of every single user-facing string can be really powerful. Of course, catching issues is a good use case, but I also think it's about understanding the architecture of how your products are built. So there's a big difference, say, between hard-coded strings and strings with that are shown to the user through key value pairs, for instance. One of those allows for flexibility and the other doesn't. So if you're able to influence your organization into changing even the architecture of how your product is built, that's very powerful because it means that instead of having to rely on developers to do that, you can take ownership of that. And again, this doesn't mean that you are going to start doing the developer's work for them or you're going to become a developer. It's about understanding what is possible and therefore influencing that conversation. I think one problem that I know I personally have run into, and I know a lot of content designers have run into, is this issue of influence, right? And so we tend to complain and say, I don't have influence, I don't have a seat at the table. I want to look at it from a little bit of a different perspective. Let's look at it from the engineer's perspective, because I think that there's a really big difference in thinking that we need to acknowledge first before we can even have these types of conversations. I don't know if this is a term already, it probably is, but I've sort of called it top down versus bottom up thinking. And when you mix them, it can really cause a lot of friction and cause people to distrust what you're saying. So little experiment. When you think of a product, like what do you picture? So if you close your eyes and I say the word and I ask you to think of a product, and I think I'm talking about software in particular, what do you see? I'd be really interested to see what people say in the chat, if anyone can share what immediately comes to mind for them. So if you close your eyes or just sort of stare into space, and I ask you, what do you picture when I say the word software? Like, what do you see? Does anyone have any attempt to answer? Okay, like a Figma flow. Yep, cool. Yep, great. So the actual screens. Anyone else? Feel free to answer. Yeah, software application or a website. Yeah, cool. Like an old floppy disk. Yep. 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 Um, Brings me back to the days when you have to put six disks to play Lemmings on your computer. Um, Ideally something that's helpful, a CD. Yeah, great. So what I'm bet it's not a trick question, by the way. What I what we tend to think of when we say the word product is the user interface, right? So what the user sees, how the user engages with the product. That's pretty natural, right? That's kind of like a an obvious thing to say. Um, but it means that we only go deeper into the technical stack when something forces us to. So we only engage with it when there's a restriction or a constraint, and there's something blocking us from doing what we want to do. And so the user experience is the main event, um, naturally. When you shift to working with developers or engineers, there's a little bit of a shift in thinking necessary because engineers will often think bottom up. And so they will think, what data exists? Where is it stored? How does it move? The user interface is optional. There are engineers and developers who may not engage with the user interface at all. This is what the terminal is good for, right? A command line interface, being able to make changes to a product without having to engage with the user interface. And so they are thinking about logic and dependencies and infrastructure. And it's important to state that this is not wrong or right. It's literally just how you think about the main work that you're doing. And so there are different entry points into the same product. What The issue is that when you mix these types of thinking, it gets you into trouble. So when you go into a room and as a content designer, you start talking about, well, I just want to make a simple change. I want to change this string, right? And people are pushing back, that can often be interpreted by a content designer as, oh, well, I'm getting pushback, and these people are being belligerent, or like I'm just getting. It's a kind of like a no culture. The issue is that it might be that your string is not hard coded. It's a localization string. And so it needs to be changed in 14 different places. There needs to be an approval process. There needs to be some coordination between two different teams that have strings in two different repos. So there's just a little bit of thinking that goes into something that on the surface appears quite simple, but underneath is quite complex. And I think when you go into a conversation with engineers, not understanding that or not knowing that, you may not realize it, but your ignorance of that actually breaks trust a little bit. And I hate to say it that way, and I hate to put it that way, but if you go into a meeting and developers and engineers know that you don't understand how the product is structured and how the product is built, they will then form an assumption about, well, this person doesn't know how the product is built. We can't really engage with them on these types of technical topics. Now, that might seem a little harsh, and I'm being very stereotypical there, and obviously that doesn't describe every single situation. So I need to do a little bit of throat clearing there. But this is something that I've experienced firsthand, and I know that others have. Understanding even just how things are, the architecture of the environment you're in, it goes a long way into understanding what is and isn't possible. So it's just really important when you start going into discussions with technical colleagues, understanding, okay, well, where do our strengths live? Like, how is our product structured? We'll get into that a little bit a lot. a little bit in the next section. So as I sort of skipped a little bit ahead, but when you're thinking about the right word for a button or the right action, you're thinking about, okay, does this sound right? Does this match our voice and tone? Is this something that is obviously the difference between submit and save does have technical consequences there. And you may even know the difference, right? So you know that submit means that data is flowing through to some sort of form somewhere which is stored, but save has different connotations. It's saying that you will have information that the user will be able to come back to later, perhaps. Um, and you're thinking about that from the user interface level. Engineers and developers are thinking about that from the architecture level. So, where are these strings located? Is the same key for this? If you're using key value pairs, is the string is the key showing up somewhere else? And if you change something, what breaks? I don't know if anyone has been using these types of coding tools lately, Claude Code and so on. You very quickly find that when you start building things, you change one things and then a completely random, almost seemingly disconnected element from what you changed has now broken. Um, this is something that you need to keep in mind when working with your technical colleagues. They're not just thinking about, oh, yes, I can just change that string and everything's fine. They're thinking, if I change this, what's going to break? And if something's going to break, am I going to get called at 2 a.m. tonight because I'm on call or whatever? So yeah, I just mentioned that, so I'll move on. So I realize this is a little bit of a hacky analogy, but I don't think that develop content designers need to learn how to code. I don't think that, especially now, I don't think that's something we need to know. I don't think we need to become developers. I don't know if anyone has seen The Matrix. If you haven't, I think you should. There's a scene at the end of The Matrix where the Neo, the protagonist, he starts seeing the world of the Matrix, but in code, so he can sort of see the highlights and the shapes of everything, but it's made up of that green code. And I think it's a decent analogy to suggest that we don't need to understand like, the code within the matrix. You just need to know that it's there and that it's underneath the surface. Even that awareness goes a long way into thinking how you anticipate what questions you ask, or when you're starting to scope out an idea, you can start thinking ahead and think, okay, do I what architectural elements do I need to keep in mind here? Do I need to go speak to a technical colleague about this first? Um, so just I think that the you're not going to learn everything. You don't need to learn everything. I don't think you need to learn the different types of APIs. But you should know what an API does. And I think that's the difference. And so that sort of leads me into my next point, which is defining what it means to be technical, because it often can mean different things to different people. And in your organization, understanding what technical means will be very dependent on your role, your colleagues, your responsibilities, what product you're working on. I think it's the wrong way to think about it to suggest that being technical means being a developer or that you need to learn absolutely everything. Not even crack developers know everything. There's so much to know that you can't possibly know everything, or you don't need to have full competence. What I do think you should starting to establish a baseline of is having a vocabulary. So starting to just understand what these things are. So front end, back end, database, API, key value, localization, string, component. These types of terms are something that you should begin to get familiar with. Um, and I think it's good to get to a point where you have these so-called known unknowns. Like you know what you don't know. And so you can go into a meeting and start thinking, okay, is this going to have any dependencies, or is there something that we need to look out for when changing anything? Um, I think participation and not mastery is a good motto. to have. You want to participate and you want to get involved. You don't necessarily need to do everything yourself, and it's just enough to have a map. Um, there's a quote in the or a comment rather in the chat suggesting the same term has different meanings from place to place. Absolutely right. This is entirely organizationally dependent as well. So I'm sort of trying to give a broad overview here, but you will need to do a lot of hard work in understanding what does your product look like? What does the tech stack look like in your organization? There was a someone who posted in the content and UX Slack recently, who asked if anyone had any advice for a problem they were dealing with, where their product had several different code repositories. And it was fine to sort of locate where these strings lived in these different repos. But it was actually another problem entirely to get these teams to coordinate and change these strings when they needed to because of different deployment schedules. That won't happen in in some organizations, but for many organizations it will. Oh, looks like the person who asked that question's in the chat, so there you go. Um, I hope you solved that problem, by the way. I'd be keen to hear about it. But it just goes to show that no one organization, no two organizations are going to be alike, and so you need to do some work in figuring that out. Um, I like to use a little bit of a framework for this type of thinking or for this type of work. Once you've sort of scoped out what your organization looks like and what you can do, start thinking about three things. The first is what is it that you can do yourself? Is there anything that you can do that will that the organization will allow you to do, that developers are happy with you doing? Is that making a pull request to change strings? Great. Then I think that that's all the better that you can and should do that if your organization allows you to do that. If you don't need to execute. Understanding it at least is the next step. So you don't need to actually do it, but you do need to understand it. So you may not be able to make pull requests or coding changes. Um, but you may need to know that, okay, there are a few different repos. And so you do need to understand where these live. You may need to understand that, well, none of the strings are in key value pairs, they're all hard coded. So understanding that difference often can save you from making embarrassing suggestions as well. Because if you go into an engineering conversation and you start and you've just learned about JSON and how we should move all of our strings to JSON files and key value pairs and isn't that great? Um, I'm sorry to say you may be met with a few eye rolls from all of your developer colleagues who might be thinking, well, everything's hard coded, like it's going to take forever to move that, and we've got so much tech debt that we can't. So just understanding, I think, can save you a lot, and then finally, just knowing something exists is enough. Just knowing how your product is made can really, really be. I really can't emphasize enough just how much knowing how your product is structured, what technology it's using, um, will help people trust you. Um, we talk a lot of the time about building influence, and a lot of that's in content work. Yes, a lot of that work is in understanding how other disciplines work and also the product itself at the architectural level. How is it made? If you can and you can find someone who's willing to chat with you, I would highly recommend pulling them into a room for 30 minutes and just asking the most pedestrian questions. Um, what tech stack does that product use? What's the difference between this server and this server? What's in our backend? What APIs are we using for this feature? You know, all those sorts of questions. I've personally found that when you tend to ask those questions of people, people like it because it makes them appear smart, and people like talking about themselves and showing off how smart they are. So you should use that kind of flattery to your advantage, I think. You should buy them a coffee too, make it worth their while. So I don't want to get into, absolutely everything that you need to learn, because it's going to be very, very contextually dependent. And so you're going to have to do a little bit of work in understanding what your product looks like and what your colleagues will even almost allow you to do. But there are five things that are worth starting with that can sort of put you on this journey to understanding a few more technical concepts. So the first thing is know where your content actually lives. For a lot of content designers, they will tend to think, well, my content lives in Figma because the Figma file is then handed off to developers and then it's transformed into the product, and I don't actually know how it's done. Um, I would encourage you to pick a piece of content and then actually map it and understand where it lives, because it can be stored in a few different ways. So, is it in a CMS, which may very well be the case if you are doing a lot of localization? It might be in something like Phrase, or Localize, and then moved into the product using an API. Is it hard coded? For a lot of products, there are many strings that are just simply hard coded, just straight into JavaScript, and there's no sort of key value involved there. Um, do you use JSON files? If so, congratulations. You're able to do a lot with those. But just understanding where they live, it may very well be the case, and often is the case, that for one product, strings are stored in a variety of different ways. And so that may differ from feature to feature. If you've bolted on a product through an acquisition, that's very often the case that you'll find different repos and strings contained in different ways. So I think doing a little bit of effort in understanding where your strings live, and even being able to go in there and look at it, look at the code, will do it demystifies a lot once you start understanding where this content is. Um, and it also means that you can start scoping work accurately too. When you start understanding the difficulties involved in updating things, you can then be accurate when having these types of conversations. And it means that you know who needs to be involved, and you can start making decisions about, okay, this is a bigger project than I originally thought it might be. I know earlier in my career, not necessarily in terms of product architecture, but you tend to make naive statements because you just don't know what you don't know. Unfortunately, that can often backfire on you. So it's good to scope out and understand the lay of the land first. Um, Understanding what a repo is. It's interesting to. I think when I started on my technical journey and started working in digital products, I was often very scared of code and getting into GitHub and looking at stuff, and it all looks a bit weird, and you start thinking, why can't I just download something from GitHub? Like, where's the exe file that I can download? And understanding that it's not really meant for that is a good shift. I would highly recommend going to GitHub, making an account. Oh, we've got a comment in the chat now. GitHub terrifies me. I mean, this is a great example, right? Um, get making it the good thing about GitHub is, you are not going to break anything or change anything unless you mean to. Um, but it is a wonderful tool to be able to go in and actually see the code for a product at the source of truth. I think we need to start shifting our mindset. Having Figma be the source of truth for content is not right. We should be thinking as the code as the source of truth. And so I would highly recommend going to GitHub, starting a free account. On the homepage of GitHub, there's a section where they have trending repos, trending repositories. Just pick one and start looking inside it, and having a look around and looking at what does the structure of code look like, and how many different files are there, and what's actually contained in them. Um, there are some great GitHub tutorials online, and some great GitHub videos, GitHub for beginners. I would encourage you to watch one and understand what's the difference between Git and GitHub. Git being the underlying software that manages version control. GitHub is just sort of the storage place. It's the house where all the repositories live. And Holly in the chat is right. It's very unintuitive. If you're coming to it and you're using it for the first time, you really don't understand what you're looking at. And I have to say, like, again, all love to our engineering friends, they're not the best at naming things. Like if you're talking about, well, what's a pull request? Like, why am I making a request to pull something. Like who's pulling it and why? Like why is it named that way? Just going in there and and looking up some definitions is really great. If you're comfortable, I would even jump into an AI tool like Claude or GPT and ask it, give me a crash course on GitHub. I need to understand from a basic perspective what this means. What's a pull request? What's a branch? What's a fork? Understanding these different types of concepts can help you understand how your colleagues are working. Great suggestion in the chat. If you see a simple project or someone shares a simple project, having a look at what's in those files can be really great. So would highly recommend going in there. And again, you're not going to break anything. Unless the people, if you want to actually make a change to code, it has to be approved. So don't worry. You can go in and just start looking around. So would highly recommend that. And this goes to something bigger, which is if you understand what a repository is and how it works, depending on the organization you're in, this may enable you to actually get in there yourself and start making pull requests to change code. No more asking a developer, oh, hey, can you change this string for me or can you do this? Understanding how this works can actually empower you to do this on your own. Again, it doesn't mean you're becoming a developer. It means you are enabling the content experience to be better by taking it on yourself. Um, this is a scary one. So the terminal. Um, I don't. This is probably the one that is the least important, especially now because there's so many great coding tools out there. I think content designers, including myself, can be quite confused or scared. I know I was about using the terminal and don't quite understand why. Like, why am I using a terminal here, or a command line interface? Um, and I know I was like, well, why can't I just use a graphic user interface to just engage with things? Um, the cool thing about a terminal is that you can do a lot of things at once, and it can enable you to do all sorts of different things for content design. So, for example, if you wanted to do an audit of all the strings in your product, organized by component or file. Doing that by hand is going to take a long time, a long, long time. In the terminal, you can do it in seconds. You can put a few commands in there and make a report of all the strings in your product. If you are going in as the first content designer into a product and you need to get an understanding of like where are all of these strings, where do they live, the terminal can help you to do that. Um, I would not recommend trying to go deep on the terminal. That it can get really confusing. You certainly can if you want to. I do think AI coding tools are making this a little bit not obsolete but unnecessary for content designers to engage with. But as an experiment, go to GitHub, start an account, um, get a repo onto your computer, and then use the terminal to search within it, to look through all of the different strings. Do an audit, get all of the search for strings that are more than 40 characters that are at risk of truncation. Search for every string that has an exclamation mark so you can find it and edit it straight away. You can do just like that with the right command. And that's why the terminal is so powerful. And I think, again, like it goes back to that bottom up and top down thinking. Engaging with the terminal for me, I know personally, was very unintuitive because that's not how I've used products in the past. But once you understand that a product is really made up of a series of different pieces of data in different places, it begins to make a little bit more sense. So certainly don't have to do that, but I would recommend giving it a go. I mentioned this before, so knowing how your product is built, what coding languages were used to make it, what is contained in the database that you have, what type of APIs are you using, how is data transferred from one place to another, even just a vague understanding of how it's created and how it's structured will help you. It'll help you when engaging with conversations. It also means that when speaking with developers and technical colleagues, they know that they can trust you to at least follow along. And that means that you might get invited into conversations that you wouldn't have otherwise. Again, I would find someone who's charitable with their time and who's friendly with you, and just ask them a bunch of very pedestrian questions. And I think you'll be surprised at what you find. Skill five, I would highly recommend this, using AI to make technical changes. So one of the great things about tools like Claude Code and Codex is that you can now ask to make changes in plain English. You don't need to use the terminal. So if you download a repo onto your computer, for instance, and then you can use Claude Code, for instance, you can connect it to that repo and say, give me a list of all the strings with exclamation marks, change them to full stops, periods, make a pull request. Done. Like you don't need to involve developers or engineers. Again, depending on your organization, depending what you have access to, all of that. But you can engage with the product without having to rely on other people. To me, this is really empowering, because it means that you, as a content designer, can see something and then you can go and change it. So I would highly recommend even just getting something like Claude Code or Cursor, ask it to build like a very basic web app, and then mess around with changing the code and the text within it, within the coding agent itself. It becomes a little bit addictive, I have to say. Um, so I want to encourage you. I'm sort of coming to the end here about for this talk, but I really want to encourage you, about what you can do next, and how to move on. And I think there are a lot of people who might be thinking, well, like, why do I need to learn technical concepts? Um, and I would just say, like, if you've ever been in a situation where you don't know what's running or why, or what's happening or why, um, you've ever made a decision about content but have to rely on others to get it done, and you don't know where it lives, or you feel cut out of conversations, that's a reason, I think, to engage with these technical concepts more. Um, it will be up to you personally to decide how deep you want or need to go in your organization. You may not need to at all. I would still recommend at least engaging with it a little bit. But you personally will need to go on that journey and figure out what works for your organization. Um, One thing I will say is, if you're new to this, a good way to start is just finding a piece of content and then mapping it out and figuring out, where does this live? Like, where does this live in my product? And that may lead you to a conversation with a developer who can show you, oh, this is where this lives. This is in this file. This is the main branch of the product. And that can be a really good way to start relationships with people. Um, so I also want to leave you with some encouragement. I really think it's true that, if anyone can generate text as they can now, um, content design still has a role. And I think we see that through the fact that companies like Anthropic, OpenAI are hiring content designers. Um, I don't know if anyone has used Claude Code, but there's a great little feature in Claude Code when you ask it to do something and it's thinking. Um, all of these little words pop up, as it's doing its thing in the background, and all of these funny adjectives. It won't just say thinking or loading. It'll say things like um, uh, uh, I think I saw it use the word honking once, or scheming, or that sort of thing, and it changes like every few seconds, and it's just a nice little flourish piece of taste in an AI experience, and it makes you think someone had to create that. Someone had to think about that and really come up with that, and make a design decision in order to put it into this product. And I just think that's a great metaphor, a great example of how content design still has a place in all of this, and how our taste matters more than ever. Um, But it is true also, I think that that craft alone isn't enough to get us there. So I think it's the two things together that will encourage and empower the discipline. So that's it. And look, I have to say, I'm going to be a little bit self-interested here. It was mentioned at the beginning that I do have a little bit of an offer, so I do have to be a little bit selfish and say that the UX Content Collective has launched a new course called Technical Foundations for Content Designers, and it's designed just to get your foot in the water, to read and understand where strings live in code, to navigate GitHub, use a little bit of the terminal. There's actually a final task on that in that course where you actually take a repo that we created for a fake product, and you actually make changes in GitHub and make a pull request to get a little bit familiar with that. So that went live today, actually, and everyone here can get 20% off using Meetup 20. And I've got the URL in on the slide there. Whoops. I might just whoops. I might just copy that and put that in the chat if that's
We
okay.
actually have that in the
Um,
chat, Patrick. So
oh,
Tony
perfect.
grabbed it. So we're good. We're good.
Tony,
That's great.
what a guy.
He's on
Thank
top
you,
of
Tony.
things.
So yeah, so I'm happy to answer questions or have rotten fruit thrown at me if anyone is not a fan of using the terminal. But uh, yeah, keen to hear what people have to say.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, we have a couple of questions from folks. First
Hmm.
one's from Maricel, wondering, is there a handy cheat sheet you might suggest with questions you might have when engaging engineers? Like, is this hard coded? Is this localized?
Yeah, I think it. I don't think there's like a one size fits all depending on your product, but I would start with things like where does that content live, right? Like, what does that content look like? Is it hard coded in components? Is it in JSON files where there's key value pairs? Do we have a localization platform? I suspect if you're asking this, it means that you probably don't because content designers tend to work directly in those. It might be that you do. So that's a good first question to ask, I think. Like, where does the content actually live? The second question I think I would ask is, like, how does that product work? Like, what are we using to actually power this? Are we using JavaScript? Is it written in, are we using certain APIs for sending pieces of data back and forth? Even just a basic understanding, I think, is good. And I like to start with, um, I think a good one to start with is also if I wanted to start making changes directly in product, what would that look like? Because that will enable conversations about, okay, well, we actually don't give right access to anyone other than developers. And when she said, okay, well, I'm limited then. But at least then it opens that conversation and you can start asking. So I think those three questions are a good place to start.
Excellent. Thank you. We have another question from Jameson. Jameson, you can unmute if you can. But while you attend to that, Jameson's question, he's a middle-aged UX student about 8 months into a bachelor's degree at Full Sail University. Would you
Cool.
recommend him getting his nose into this info about the technical side of everything to come out of school just that more ready or something else? There's a good bit of this. He says it's a bit over his head at this point. So, new student looking to get into this, is that too early to delve into the technical side?
I don't think it's too early. I think I would just not like don't put pressure on yourself to know absolutely everything.
Right.
I think maybe a really good place to start is probably just to say, um, like, what's the difference between a hard-coded string versus a string in a JSON file, for instance?
Okay.
Understanding like that difference, I think, will be uh, will will help you, or even things like how do strings work in a localization platform, right? Understanding where strings live in code is probably a good first step, which won't sort of overwhelm you because you can easily start getting into a point where you're like, oh my God, I need to understand like how to do a pull request and what a repo is and all that sort of stuff. Just being able to just read some code and know like, oh, that's where the string is. That's where it is in the code.
Right.
I think even that is enough.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
And I think there was something in the chat from Cullen with an update to what we talked about like maybe a half hour ago in terms of his question, I think in a forum or whatnot. Cullen, you should be able to be unmuted if you'd like to ask that or give us an update.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, happy to give a quick update, some context. Um, yeah, I'm in the content and UX Slack community, and there's a channel in there. I think it was technical maybe channel, and I went there looking for some advice on what to do in the absence of having a content management system to help engineers change strings quicker. We've
Hmm.
essentially been having an issue with some string changes that were written off on a year ago with some senior leadership. Everybody went through the whole review process. Uh, it's now March, and there's no progress on changing these strings, and they're really high impact strings in our commerce pillar, um, and was leading to an experience. In an experience that was leading to a lot of customer attrition with a subscription model that's been really controversial. And so I've just been trying to figure out how to help engineers get to the strings quicker. So I worked with one of our localization engineers, and he's been able to put together a sheet that hosts an export of our product UI strings with a link to the repository directly. So you match the string to the
Cool.
repository that it goes to, can go to it really quickly. Present that to an engineer, and he's like, "This doesn't make me happy. This kind of makes things worse for us because it makes it look like it's easy." And the hard part was the orchestration of all the teams who own these different repositories and coordinating and figuring out the level of effort and calculating everybody's engineering lead times and stuff like that. And so um, I kind of went to Patrick with the question of, hey, like, has anybody dealt with this without a CMS and had this had success? And Patrick and I had a bit of a chat, but kind of agreed that it seemed more like an organizational issue. Full disclosure, layoffs came. I was about 85-90% done with that. And the way that I started addressing it was more in a project management kind of realm, and uh, used the string database that we created and another sheet, and did a cross sheet reference that on a sheet that was more of a project management sheet with all the terms listed on it, referenced the database sheet, calculated the amount of times that that string came up, and started to calculate possible end and start dates and how big of a lift and it was. And pass that off to my team before I left. But that's kind of where I left that. But yeah, it seems like in these organizations that kind of came in earlier, we have a lot of history without a CMS. The code bases get pretty gnarly, and it gets really complicated to uh, coordinate with all the different
Yeah.
repository owners.
Yeah. Well, I'm really sorry to hear about your situation. Uh, yeah, my thoughts are with you on
Uh,
that.
thank you.
I think I think your problem was an interesting one. Um, and I think it gets to something that happens. Well, it's interesting when you start learning about how where strings live and how they work and so on. You quickly, like you have discovered, you start thinking, oh wow, this is a little bit of a mess. Like there are things over here and things over here, and why can't we just consolidate it? And then you very quickly run into the point where there are very good reasons why something is built the way it's built. maybe things were going through a startup phase, and so things had to be hard coded, and maybe there was an acquisition, and so yeah, that's in a CMS, and so um, I think though the important thing is understanding that you're not going to be able to change everything. And I don't, I'm not speaking to you directly here. I just mean sort of in general. Like content designers, a little bit of knowledge can go a long way, but it can also make you start thinking, oh, what if we changed everything and we did it like this? And it's like, well, it's actually sometimes much more efficient and much more powerful to work within the constraints you have, which like with you, you were able to do, I think, quite effectively. It sounds like you understood the lay of the land, and you said, okay, well, we've got these repos, and then you built that tool. I know there were still issues with it, in it sounds like some organizational problems, but I think you should feel very good about that work that you were doing, because it got you closer to the product. So. Yeah, thank you for sharing. If you want to email me, I'm happy to chat about it more too.
Yeah,
We can chat
yeah,
about that a little
totally.
bit more.
Yeah, it was a fun time.
Thank you, Cullen. Thank you, Patrick. Couple more questions, and if you have additional questions for Patrick, definitely drop them in the chat. This one comes from Rachel. Two questions, and definitely related. When the content you're working on lives in many places, emails, gaming software, how can the code be the source of truth for content? And how do you get through content design reviews and especially legal reviews without documentation?
Yeah, totally. It's not to say that the documentation and everything is not important or a critical part of that process. Like you obviously still need, Figma files and a place um, to collaborate and to change and so on. What I mean to say when I say that code is the source of truth is that um, it is the ultimate place where the user experiences the text. And so it is the last place to edit and change it. And so if you want to get a full understanding of what the user sees, um, then using the code, I think, is always going to be more accurate, than using a combination of files, including Figma files. Um, Again, speaking very generally here, and there are organizations where the documentation is maintained, very well and always up to date, and developers are able to take across content without having to change anything. Um, but I've experienced many times when developers are handed a Figma file and things are updated into a repo and a mistake was made. It's a mistake. It's not on purpose, but it was made that way. And so understanding where it lives and being able to change it, I think, is a much more powerful um, tool in your arsenal. So that's what I meant by that.
Well, thank you. And we had another question. It was actually for the group, question from Hannah, but Patrick, I think it's a good question for you. Talked a lot about how to kind of speak the language of engineering or how much you should know there. Have you seen an increase in the engineering side, showing an interest in what we do?
Yes, to a point. So if you speak to a lot of the content designers who are working closely with engineers in AI, so working with engineers who are training on different features and so on, it is true that the content designers I speak to at some very large organizations have had great interaction with those engineers who say, and all of a sudden realize, oh shoot, we need a lot of content here. And we actually need someone who can write all that content and who can write it well. And so in that sense, yeah, there has been, I think, an uptick in the number of engineers and developers who are seeking out people who can write well. But I also think that is happening in organizations where content designers are putting their hands up and saying, I want to be involved in this. I want to be involved in this type of work. So it requires um, a little bit of effort sometimes. But yeah, I think there has been an uptick in that, especially when it comes to evaluation too. So evaluating AI generated content, and not just, using language models as a judge to evaluate their quality, but actually getting content designers to be that human in the loop. So I think there has been some interest there for sure.
I've definitely seen some interest in the roles that I've had from engineering. One of the things that kind of came, I feel like kind of out of nowhere. One of my engineering colleagues recognized the need for our error messages to be made much more consistent. And we
Mm.
worked on a way for those to be single source in the product that I was working on. So that's one example. The engineering partner did come to me for that because they knew that as a language person, that was going to be my forte and that we could work together on it. So I can cite that example. And I've also seen a lot of instances where, at least in my work, where once engineers know that you exist and know what you do, the requests increase significantly. So I think that partnership piece, Patrick, that you mentioned, is relevant, at least in my experience.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Colin, same. Messages. Awesome. Do we have any other questions or any other perspectives on that?
Well, if not, everyone, please check out the class that Patrick mentioned, and be sure to use the Meetup 20 code if you want to join that. And again, keep an eye on all of our on the Meetup site and our social media for our upcoming events, and we hope to see you again. But for now, please join in thanking Patrick for speaking to us. Super interesting. I think we had some great engagement. Happy to see that this was a good talk for folks. So please join us again. And
Yeah, we'll see you at a future
thank you,
meeting.
Patrick. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you all. This was a lot of
Yeah.
fun. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Right.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good
Or good
night.
afternoon, as the case may be.
Yes. Go get some lunch.
Yes.
Mhm.